Today we're joined with Jaki Shelton Green, North Carolina's Poet Laureate. We're so glad you joined us. And Jaki, what led you to poetry?
Oh my. First of all, I thank you for this invitation to be with you this morning. My journey to poetry actually began when I was very young. And it probably began as a very restless, precocious child growing up in rural Orange County. I was fidgety, I was inquisitive, and it was really my grandmother who led me to writing. She would gift me these tiny little notebooks that I would write my stories in when I was very young, and that practice continued. Um, but writing was not really what I wanted to be when I grew up. As a child, I always aspired to be an oceanographer or a scientist.
Well, that's quite a journey from oceanographer to poet laureate. I'm just curious, did you ever expect that, or how did you find out you'd been named the poet laureate? Were you waiting anxiously?
No, I've never waited anxiously. My journey to literature, to the literary arts, has always been about my own uh, obsession with writing, obsession with telling story and finding the poetry that lives inside of story. Uh, but on this journey of being published and I'm a teaching writer, I never thought, I had any insight that one day I would be the North Carolina Poet Laureate. That was not on my radar. I'm esteemed, happy that it happened. The governor called me on June 19th, which happens to be my birthday, and he said, "This is Roy Cooper calling for Jaki Shelton Green." And my response was, "Roy Cooper, as in my governor, Roy Cooper?" And he said, "Yes, this is your governor, Roy Cooper." And I said, "And how may I help you?" His response was, "I'm calling to inform you that I've appointed you as the Poet Laureate of North Carolina." And that was an extremely emotional, funny, gracious moment for me.
Well, it's not new for you to be honored. I think you're in North Carolina's Literary Hall of Fame, and I think you've won the North Carolina Award for Literature. You just keep stacking them up.
Well, and I'm very humbled and gracious that my peers and the people of North Carolina and the powers that be have deemed these honors on me. But the Poet Laureate is something else. The Poet Laureate is really an ambassadorship. And to know that I'm the first African American person, only the third woman to be in this post is a very prestigious honor and one that I take very, very seriously. And at the same time, I'm having a lot of fun with it.
What does it bring to this post to have an African American or a woman in it?
I think right now, culturally in our society, it's very important for children of all colors, of all uh, different backgrounds and diversities, to see that someone who looks like them, someone who comes from where they come from, that this is possible. And my ongoing conversation with young people is there's nothing magical about how I've arrived at this place. It's called working hard, it's called having determination about what you want and really knowing who you are. So I know that in this role as the first woman of color to be a Poet Laureate of North Carolina comes much responsibility and paying homage to those who've opened doors for me before me. I know that my wings are being lifted and guided by some serious ancestors. And also, I always tell myself the children are always watching. And because they're always watching, we should be at our best. We should try to do our best. And that's what it means, tremendous responsibility and tremendous humility in the service of what this means also.
You reference ancestors. Do you feel that you are honoring them, or do you even feel their presence as you go in this work?
I most certainly feel their presence. My ancestors are always with me. My deceased daughter is always with me, guiding me. Um, so yes, and I forget, what was your other piece of the question?
How do you feel their presence?
How do I feel their presence? Oh, that's an interesting question, and I'm not even sure I can articulate, but they show up. They show up.
So, just what is the job of a poet? We hear about poets all the
Mhm.
time, and we hear about words, but what do they do? What do they mean?
What do poets do? We tell. And as a documentary poet, I use primary and secondary sources to retell historical or current events or personal narratives. So I can only talk about my role as a poet. And my role as a poet has been to use poetry as a vehicle to help public audiences find their voices and find themselves over and over again, their stories, their dreams, their inspirations, their sorrows inside the container of language, inside the container of the stories that we all carry.
Well, certainly your students look to you. Were there any writers or poets that you look to for inspiration or guidance?
So, to be honest, I admire a range of writers, um, but I did not have that writing mentor necessarily. I've been gifted to have many, many writers who have nurtured me in my adulthood as a writer. Um, but my mentors were non writers. And what impressed me is reading everything. And I not only read poetry, but I read novels. So when I think about Rumi, when I think about Hafiz, when I think about as a teenager, I was obsessed with Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath and Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and uh, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, uh, Shakespeare, the classics. So not only have writers been a beacon guiding me, it's been the everydayness of people in their stories, growing up in the rural South, paying attention to the nuance, to the codes, to the silences, to all of the cultural idioms that inform who we are as Southern people.
Well, certainly North Carolina has a long, strong literary tradition. Is that a good thing or does that help?
Oh, I think that's a fabulous thing. And I think it's fabulous because the arts are missing in our communities. The arts are missing, especially the literary arts. I shouldn't say the arts, but the literary arts are very much suppressed, not very visible in the greater communities. Um, the fact that we have so many writers, I think North Carolina's citizens have been extremely blessed. We live in our communities, we play in our communities, we interface with our libraries, our public schools. Uh, Writers in North Carolina are writers who contribute greatly to the landscape of this great state. Historically, we've done this and we continue to do this. So I think it's a very good thing. Uh, I love running into Alan Gerganas at Walmart in the garden section or running into Lee Smith at the grocery store. You know, uh, any number of people who are great in their own, who they are, but it's the everydayness of who they are as human beings and their humanity that they allow to extend to the greater community.
I think it was Lee Smith. You reminded me of something I heard her say once, like in North Carolina, you couldn't swing a dead cat without hitting a writer.
This is true.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
So Lee also teaches. I'm wondering if is it really necessary to have academic training to go into literature or poetry?
Well, I don't believe that. I'm not an academic writer. That's not been my background. Actually, economic development, legal services, being a paralegal, being a consultant for nonprofits. So, no, I don't buy into you have to be inside of the canon. I also don't buy into all great writers have to have an MFA in creative writing. It's never been a passion of mine to teach in academia. I love academia, but I've always been a community-based writer. I've always been what I consider the people's poet because I believe that writers should be accessible. And so many writers, because we are in academics, it's a very busy, demanding career. And the availability of the time to be inside of community is not necessarily always available to us. So I have been fortunate to be able to straddle both, to be the community writer, and also to teach, to be a teaching writer.
Well, there are people who still think of poetry as those Shakespearean sonnets, so that ABBA rhyme scheme. Um, is new contemporary poetry more accessible?
I think it's all accessible. It depends on our frame of reference from whence we enter. Uh, I'm amazed when I'm working with young rappers who are reframing Shakespeare or taking a Tennyson poem and turning it into spoken word. So I think it's from whence we enter. It's how we understand, how we have the craft, how we have the permission to manipulate language, to play with language. So I'm always telling my students, you have to know the classics. You should read everything. You should read everybody so you can be a discerning reader. And also, when you become a discerning reader, it's easier to become a discerning writer. It's easier to become your own best critic and appraiser of your own work.
So you see hip hop and spoken word as on the continuum of poetry?
I think they're very necessary. I think they've played vital roles. And sometimes when I'm debating this with my colleagues who consider it totally outside of the realm, I remind them that we don't pack audiences of 300 to 400 on a Monday night and a spoken word open mic. And I'm impressed by the notion of community building, that the spoken word community, that the young people have the audacity and have the ability to bring together and create community. There's so much nurturance, there's so much camaraderie, there's so much support, and even in the competitions, there's still this community of camaraderie. And there's some really bad spoken word poetry, but there's some amazing young writers who've emerged through spoken word.
So maybe I could get you to do some spoken word and read a poem for us.
Well, I don't do spoken word that way, but I'm happy to read a poem. So you requested that I read this poem that I wrote when I was very, very young, when I wrote in my 20s. Very elemental. Purpose. I am new poem. I am new woman. Writing poems about life, about thunder, and about fading dreams. I am new poem, real new poem. Fragments of black juju tales, fragments of seaweed and dust. I am new poem, skipping and flying, giving life, leaving no marks.
Thank you. So now I'm going to go back a little bit and talk about the whole process of writing. I used to try to do a little writing, and they always would say, write about what you know about.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that seems really difficult to be so self-revealing and honest. How do people get beyond that? And can you actually not write from your own life?
Oh, of course. I mean, I encourage people to resource, to research. So I also tell people to use their journals as bank accounts. In our bank accounts, we're continually making deposits and withdrawals. So my process, because I'm extremely busy, is poetry comes to me at all different types of times, when I'm peeling potatoes or when I'm asleep. But I keep journals where I'm depositing those few lines that come. And I can tell this story in the context of I went to Central America to a writing retreat in a rainforest in 2005 or 2006. I took 13 journals with me. I did not know what was in those journals, but I had been making deposits all over the place in those journals. When I got there, I opened those journals, and I came back with a manuscript. And that manuscript was this book, Breath of the Song. So we're always writing and scribing, even when I can't get to the writing. So that's one process. And then making the time. I think that we're very, very busy. This culture has us all manipulated and trained, to stay in these boxes of rush, 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 do, produce, produce, produce. And it's about quantity and not quality. And my process is to create those spaces so I can do the work. And not only do I create those spaces for me, but I recently created SistaWRITE, which is a business that allows women to travel with me to amazing places. We just returned from Morocco for a month, where we create those spaces and give ourselves the permission to be on a journey of writing for 2 weeks or a week or a month. And I think we have to be very, very intentional and mindful about how we have to craft that space according to ourselves. I have friends who set a 3-hour writing slot every day. Well, that's never worked for me because I have life to do. Something gets in the way. Sometimes I can do that, sometimes I can't do that. But I think that we have to be careful about how we try to formulate a process that's not our process. So I think people have to find their unique space for how they show up in their writing process. I know people who write every morning. They get up, they write for an hour before they start their day. I write at the end of the day. But I'm constantly remembering to remember, and my cell phone has become a very useful depository. I have a recent book that I wrote for my daughter, my deceased daughter, who died 9 years ago, and that entire poem, it's a 1-poem book, was composed on my cell phone.
Tell us about this book and how you were able to actually write about the death of your daughter.
Imani died in 2009, in June of 2009. And I really wanted to write about her, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. I was really held hostage by that grief, and I did not write until perhaps 2016. And it started because I was in my study, and a bookshelf fell on my foot, and I picked up the book, from the floor, and it was actually a journal that I had forgotten that I started keeping on the day she was diagnosed with cancer. And I wrote in that journal every day until the day she died. And then I stopped and I never wrote again. And then I had her journal because Imani also journaled that journey with cancer. And I started reading the two journals, and I'd forgotten a lot of those passages. But apparently they were evoking this narrative inside of my psyche and my spirit, because in the wee hours of the night, the lines, "I want to undie you," kept coming. And I ended up with this book, "I Want to Undie You." It was not a conscious poem in that I sat down to write it, but as I often tell people, sometimes poems find us. And this poem really found me and allowed me to be the conduit for it. And so I'm really happy that I could capture that. And I also think that's another one of those ancestral moments when Imani's spirit was guiding me and saying, "It's time, you can do this now."
Now, you also were gravely ill at one point. I remember seeing you being
Yes.
actually a little afraid.
Yeah.
Were you able to write through that?
I haven't written about that. It was shortly after Imani's death. I was diagnosed with Lyme disease, but an entire year had gone by without a diagnosis. So I was in and out of intensive care, many hospitalizations. I was in a wheelchair. I did not walk. I couldn't talk. I couldn't process information. I could not certainly be sitting here having this conversation with you. So it was, when you saw me, it was pretty frightening. But medicine is amazing.
I would agree it was frightening. Now, let's hear a poem that will take us away from this place.
Yes. So I'm going to read a poem about my grandmother. And outside of working in academia, I have worked for many years working with people who are incarcerated, people who are homeless. This particular poem comes out of a series of a 1-year residency I did with women on death row, Wake County Prison for Women. And for 1 year, I only allowed the women to write about the subject of hands. And because I learned what I teach, and I always accept the assignments that I offer people, this is one of the poems from that series. I know the grandmother one had hands. I know the grandmother one had hands, but they were always in bowls, folding, pinching, rolling the dough, making the bread. I know the grandmother one had hands, but they were always underwater, sifting rice, bluing clothes, starching lives. I know the grandmother one had hands, but they were always in the earth, planting seeds, removing weeds, growing knives, burying sons. I know the grandmother one had hands, but they were always under the cloth, pushing it along, helping it birth into skirt, dress, curtains to lock out night. I know the grandmother one had hands, but they were always inside the hair, parting, plaiting, twisting it into rainbows. I know the grandmother one had hands, but they were always inside pockets, holding the knots, counting the twisted veins, holding on to herself, lest her hands disappear into sky. I know the grandmother one had hands, but they were always inside the clouds, poking holes for the rain to fall.
That's gorgeous. I love that. You touched on something that I want to get back to. You mentioned you traveled to the rainforest, and I know recently you were in Morocco.
Mm-hmm.
Do these travels teach you things? Do they come back and show up in your work?
Oh, most definitely. I have another one-poem book that was written on a train from Paris to Switzerland. So the journey informs us. And there's always the anatomy of that journey and the voice of the journey itself and how we find ourselves over and over again in different places. So this is going to perhaps sound a little unfamiliar, but it is only when I'm away that I can really write about personal narratives, especially about my family in certain contexts. So the book that I wrote in Switzerland, it's called Swiss Time, was a book about my father's death that I always wanted to write about. And I had not been able to revisit carving out a space where I could do that work. And it just came. It was so organic for me to write it there. So yes, I think anytime we step into other worlds, we step into other customs, we are able to witness other norms and other cultural habits. It does. It directs, it influences the texture of that experience, the language, different languages. I'm especially excited about the aesthetic of incorporating different languages into my writing, be it Arabic or Amazigh, which is a Berber language, or French, or whatever. So yes, most definitely travel, visitations. I always say that tenderness unto the unknown is tenderness unto oneself. So if we can show up in these spaces without any judgments, any preconceived notions, or any any expectations. But for me, it's to show up. It's to show up. And when I show up in these places, stories are revealed, narratives are revealed, poems find me and tell me to write them.
I'm a little curious about when you were teaching women's prison. What did you expect and how were you received?
So I've been doing this since the 70s. It was the first and only time to work with women on death row. The reception varied. We're talking about women who've been incarcerated, many of them for many, many years. And I wanted to focus on this concentration of hands, because the power of their hands is what landed them there. And for them to think about that power. So we did a lot of visualization exercises where I'd ask them to close their eyes and allow their hands to remember the last time they touched their daughter's hair or brushed their daughter's hair. And for some of them, I remember a woman said, my daughter is 15, the last time I saw her was 3, and I did brush her hair when she was here, and she wrote about that. Or to ask them to write about the last time they touched their mother or grandmother's hands. And many of them had mothers or grandmothers that had died while they were incarcerated, and they had not seen those women for over 10 or 15 years. So allowing the visceral experience of what it means to be in touch, because the body has memory. The body has memory. Hands remember. I also wanted that exercise to be redemptive for them, if I can use that word, for them to also allow themselves to practice self-forgiveness, to think about what forgiveness means through their hands. And for a lot of women who did not like to be touched, or who did not want to be touched, who were afraid to be touched, because physicality, and a lot of them were women who had been raped or sexually assaulted or abused by spouses or partners. To see at the end of that, the hugging, the holding of hands, the healing that came through that. I know that poetry saves lives. I know that poetry offers so much for people in the space of healing. So it was very different, and not very different, because these were women who had incredible stories that needed to be told. And as the poet laureate, it's the silenced voices, it's those voices on the edge. I want to be in the peripheral communities. As much as I enjoy the speaking engagements, as much as I enjoy being invited to universities, I also am intentional about making sure that I am in those non-traditional, and I don't want to say non-traditional, but yes, I want to interface with non-traditional writers. But I also want to be in those communities that are underserved, those communities where there might not be any poets, at least any who have named themselves poets. But I know they're there, and I want those stories.
So how is it different with that audience versus at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke, where you have this whole other realm of experiences?
There is no difference.
There's no difference.
There is no difference. I teach the same. I teach the same curriculum.
And what about the way that students approach it?
They love documentary poetry. It's a bit of a strange animal to them. It's a strange animal to many people because we don't talk about documentary poetry.
Tell us, explain that.
So documentary poetry is using primary and secondary resources, incorporated, intertwined with poetics. And I'll give you an example. Natasha Trethewey, when she was the Poet Laureate of the United States, traveled to New Orleans with a film crew and went through all the different wards, retelling the stories of the people poetically with poetry. Film crew, poetry. Documentary, but not as a journalist. So my students really, really lean into that. And we talk a lot about what it means to be a documentarian, period. And what are the permissions that we need from our subject matters? How do we not show up intrusive? How do we show up as a facilitator and not a director? So the amazement for them is when they do the research with different assignments, and we look at everything from the Magna Carta to sales documents of the sale of human beings, Hurricane Hugo, Beyonce's Lemonade. We deconstruct, and we start off doing a face. What do you call it? A selfie. I'm sorry. We start out doing a selfie poem, but they can't make a visual selfie. So the selfie poem has to be a selfie that's with primary resources or secondary resources where they're documenting themselves. So it's a fun class. It's a lot of fun, but a lot of the exercises I also use when I do residencies with elementary school children, which is fascinating to them when I tell fifth graders, oh, we did this yesterday at Duke. And they're like, really? We're doing what they did? It's accessible.
So what's next for Jaki Shelton Green?
Oh my, I'm working on a collection of poetry. I'm always working on poems. And there's a novel that I've been writing for, I'm embarrassed to say, almost 20 years. And I have no idea when that novel will ever manifest. It's really up to the characters. It's when they decide we're done. So I'm still working. And still doing residencies, still traveling. My SistaWRITE business is very dear to me. I truly enjoy the opportunity to facilitate these spaces where women can come, and I facilitate creativity salons and workshops and one day pop-up salons for women writers.
Well, I think I've exhausted my questions. Is there anything you would like to add or that we should know?
I think we covered a lot. I'm grateful to the state of North Carolina, to the governor for this appointment, and I look forward to unearthing some of the many, many stories that I know our citizens have that we all should hear. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank you for taking this time to be with us, and I would like to let people know that Quail Ridge Books in Raleigh will honor you, and you can hear readings of Jaki on Sunday, August 26th at 2 p.m. at Quail Ridge Books if you want even more. And I thank you for the wonderful work you've done for the state of North Carolina.
Thank you, Faye.